And he says that the next stage for America is to be a unit of a world government. But he says that the same basic sort of process it took the US to go through in order to be fully united as federated states um, is similar to what the world's going to have to go through. So, and that this just the importance of this day, and that this world order is not going to be born without probably violence, and that we can see this happening, that we are in the age of transition. And then he ends with giving the prophecies, the letters written to Napoleon III and also to Kaiser Wilhelm, warning them that if they did not turn to him, what would happen. And of course, those are the most striking of all the warnings, particularly the one about Berlin and blood on the banks of the Rhine. And so he quotes that to, I think, help remind the Americans that this is aimed at, this letter is aimed to, or the people in the West, that Baha'u'lláh knew what he was talking about, that his predictions are sure. So now, tonight, we are going to talk about two other processes that are happening right now and have been going on for about 100 or more years. The first is the collapse of Islam, and then the disintegration of Christianity. And as we get into this, particularly the collapse of Islam, I'm sure that many of you in this particular group of young growing scholars, you know a lot about Persian history, Middle Eastern history. And so please feel free to speak up as we go through this next section. He gets into the history, but in his usual style, he, Shoghi Effendi alludes to people and events without getting into the actual hard facts of what happened. So I did a little bit of research yesterday on some of the things he brings up, but not enough. So anyway, let's get started in this. And Mateen, could you read the first paragraph, please?
Yeah, of course. Sorry again if the music is like overlapping my voice, but
That's all right.
the collapse of the power of the Shiite hierarchy in a land which had for centuries been one of the impregnable strongholds of Muslim fanaticism was the inevitable consequence of that wave of secularization, which at a later time was to invade some of the most powerful and conservative I can't say that word. Ecclesiastical institutions in both the European and American continents. Though not the direct outcome of the last war, this sudden trembling which had seized this hitherto immovable pillar of Islamic orthodoxy accentuated the problems and deepened the restlessness with which a war-wearing world was being afflicted. Shia Islam had lost once for all in Baha'u'llah's native land, and as the direct consequence of its implacable hostility to his faith, its combative power had forfeited its rights and privileges, had been degraded and demoralized, and was being condemned to hopeless obscurity and ultimate extinction. No less than 20,000 martyrs, however, had to sacrifice their lives ere the cause for which they had stood and died could register this initial victory over those who were the first to repudiate its claims and mow down its gallant warriors. Vileness and poverty were stamped upon them, and they returned with wrath from God.
So this is written 1936. This is obviously before the 1979 revolution in Iran. But he's talking about how by that point in history in the 30s, the collapse of the power of the Shia clergy in Iran, and I'm assuming also Eastern Iraq, because the cities in eastern Iraq were really where the strongholds of the Muslim clergy who were the leaders of Shia Islam were located. So does anyone know the history of the early 20th century in Iran, of the collapse of the clergy? Obviously, a resurgence has happened in there, at least in my lifetime, with the revolution in '79. But does anyone know much about what happened?
Like the Shah was removed and the Ayatollah Khomeini came into charge. You talking about that
That
revolution?
was '79, but much earlier, the first
Oh,
part,
much earlier. I don't know.
the first part of the 20th century. I mean, we know that in the early years of the 20th century, Iran underwent a revolution where they ultimately threw out the Shah, and which you'll talk about in a minute. And there was a brief attempt at a constitutional government and a legislature. And Abdul Baha was actually sort of involved with some of that. Baha'is initially were asked to take part in that legislature, and then when it went south, Abdul Baha had them pull out. But then, of course, the last Shah's father staged, basically, he was a military officer, and he took over and proclaimed himself a new Shah and established a new dynasty. But I'm assuming that during that period, as part of losing the power of the monarchy or having it cut back, that at the same time, the Shia clergy in Iran must have also lost power. And that may well account for what happened in 1979, a last attempt to regain that. But by the 30s, it says that this was losing its power in Iran. And it was the retribution for what happened with the persecution of the faith, particularly those 20,000 Babi martyrs that forfeited its rights and privileges, degraded and demoralized, condemned to hopeless obscurity and ultimate extinction. Well, obviously, it's not an ultimate extinction at the moment, but probably not far from it.
Yeah, didn't honestly like that sounds great, but again, back when 1979, Shah got removed, Ayatollah came in. We're back to step one where we were. Iran is majority are Shiite. I mean, the rest of the Middle East is Sunni, but still.
Yeah, so it's hard to know because this was written long before the revolution. So clearly they must have gone into a period where they lost some power, and it can also explain the ferocity and the ruthlessness of the Ayatollahs when the Shia clergy regained power in '79.
Wasn't there a guy the U.S. wanted to remove? I think he was a prime minister because they thought he was going to be a communist in Iran.
Well, yeah, he was the prime minister, and yeah, and actually the CIA did it, but they did it at the instigation of the British because of their petroleum interest in Iran. But he actually was going to be a big problem, not just because of upsetting the Western interest in Iranian oil, but he was truly, I think, moving in the orbit of the Soviet Union, which would have been a very big problem in the 1950s. This was the early 1950s. When you don't, everyone that I see on the screen is too young to remember the Cold War that happened from the end of World War II all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was a really scary period because very quickly, because they had taken some of the scientists from the Nazis to Germany, from Germany to Russia, they very quickly were getting technology that was making the Soviet Union a very grave military threat, including their acquisition of nuclear bombs. And the idea that a person running Iran would be a close ally of the Russian Empire, of Russia, of the Soviet Union, was very scary to the West. So, assassinations are never a good thing, but it was more complex than it's been portrayed, as I understand it. So, Mom, can you read the next paragraph, please?
Behold, writes Baha'u'lláh, commenting on the decline of a fallen people, how the sayings and doings of Shia Islam have dulled the joy and fervor of its early days, and tarnished their pristine
Pristine.
brilliancy of its light. In its primitive days, whilst they still adhere to the precepts associated with the name of the Prophet, the Lord of mankind, their career was marked by an unbroken chain of victories and triumphs. As they gradually strayed from the path of their ideal leader and master, as they turned away from the light of God and corrupted the principle of his divine unity, and as they increasingly centered their attention upon them who were only the revealers of the potency of his word, their power was turned into weakness, their glory into shame, their courage into fear. Thou dost witness to what a pass they have come.
So, of course, as Baha'is, we accept Shia Islam as the correct path of Islam rather than Sunni Islam. But he's talking here about how they went from their glory days, where they were the true keepers of the teachings of the Prophet, and gradually strayed from the path of their ideal leader and master. You notice in here, he said, as they increasingly centered their attention upon them who were only the revealers of the potency of his word. Who is it they were turning to, that the Shias were paying attention to, rather than Muhammad and Ali and Hussein? It's very interesting that the way he precisely worded that, the revealers of the potency of his word. Or only the revealers of the potency of his word. Any thoughts on what the Guardian is talking about there?
Like maybe the clergy?
That's what my guess would be, that they weren't listening. They stopped going straight to the source of the Quran and listened instead to the sermons and commentary of clergy. Only the revealers of the potency of his word, that people who were talking about Islam but had no spiritual insight or the ability to be revealers of scripture. By listening to them, their power was turned into weakness, their glory into shame, their courage into fear. So, of course, Baha'u'lláh has been dead over 100 years. So even by the 19th century, this was his observation of Shia Islam. So he says that all of this was synchronized with the political fall of the monarchy, the Qajar dynasty. So I'm assuming that the time period he's talking about for the fall of the Shia ecclesiastical leaders was the same period in the early 20th century when the Shah was brought down. And then he gives a very fast summary of the persecution of the faith under the Shah. Now he's turning to the Sunnis and talking about the overthrow of the Sultanate and the Caliphate, the twin pillars of Sunni Islam, can be regarded in no other light except as the inevitable consequence of the fierce, the sustained and deliberate persecution with which the monarchs of the tottering house of Uthman, the recognized successors of the Prophet Muhammad, had launched against it. and how all of this was based upon came out of the city of Constantinople, the traditional seat of both the Sultanate and the Caliphate. So one of the things that it's important to remember is the Baha'i faith was first persecuted by Shia Islam, but Baha'u'lláh was persecuted both by Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, because the Sultan of Turkey was also the Caliphate, the Caliph, the head, the title head of Sunni Islam. It had become a totally secular position. So he was the head of the faithful, as well as the political head of the Ottoman Empire. And this was both based out of Constantinople. Have any of you been to Constantinople? If you go to the Royal Palace, Topkapi Palace, you will see there that to this day, there's a mosque within the palace, and it's also not very far from the Blue Mosque. It's an easy walking distance to the Blue Mosque, but there's a small mosque there within the palace, and they keep a mullah reciting the Quran 24 hours a day. I mean, obviously they keep changing the people that do it, but there's someone there sitting in a booth reciting the Quran day and night, because this was the center for the caliph and not just the sultan there at Topkapi Palace. So from the time Baha'u'lláh set foot on Turkish soil and was made a virtual prisoner of the most powerful potentate of Islam, to the year of the Holy Land's liberation from Turkish yoke, successive caliphs, in particular the sultans Abdul Aziz and Abdul Hamid, had in the full exercise of the spiritual and temporal authority which their exalted office had conferred upon them, afflicted both the founder of our faith and the center of his covenant with such pain and tribulation as no mind can fathom, nor pen or tongue describe. They alone could have measured or borne them. So when Baha'u'lláh is sent to prison in Akka by the Sultan of Turkey, he's acting not only as a political leader, but as the head of the Islamic Sunni branch of Islam. So this is very important to understand. Let's see. Shaheen, could you read the next paragraph? These quotes from Baha'u'lláh.
To these afflictive trials, Baha'u'lláh has repeatedly testified, by the righteousness of the Almighty, were I to recount to thee the tale of the things that have befallen me, the souls and minds of men would be incapable of sustaining its weight. God himself beareth me witness. 20 years have passed. He, addressing the kings of Christendom, has written, during which we have each day tasted the agony of a fresh tribulation. No one of them that were before us hath endured the things we have endured. Would that ye could perceive it. They that rose up against us have put us to death, have shed our blood, have plundered our property, and violated our honor. Recall to my mind my sorrows. He in another connection has revealed. My cares and my anxieties, my woes and trials, the state of my captivity, the tears that I have shed, the bitterness of mine anguish, and now mine imprisonment in this far off land. Couldst thou be told what hath befallen the ancient beauty, thou would flee into the wilderness and weep with a great weeping. Every morning I arose from my bed, I discovered the hosts of countless afflictions masked behind my door. And every night when I lay down, lo, my heart was torn with agony at what it had suffered from the fiendish cruelty of its foes.
So the Guardian is trying to help us remember just how badly Baha'u'lláh was treated. So once they were in Turkish territory or the Ottoman territory, the faith was under the control of the Sultan. And despite all of the efforts of the might of the Ottoman Empire, yet they were not able to, as he says, this despotism should have failed in the end to extirpate a mere handful of its condemned subjects. And the fact that the faith thrived and was not crushed despite the treatment it received from the Ottoman Empire, he says, must to every unbelieving observer remain one of the most intriguing and mysterious episodes of contemporary history. In just the fact that Bahá'u'lláh was condemned by the Sultan of Turkey to perpetual solitary confinement, and yet he spends his last years at Baji. He's still a prisoner. The Sultan hasn't changed his order. And yet look what happened. So the Guardian says we must consider this essentially to be a mystery and even a miracle. The cause undoubtedly triumphed. And yet, at the same time, no unbiased mind penetrating the surface of the conditions of the prisoner of Akka could any longer mistake or deny it. Though the tension which had been relaxed was for a time heightened after Baha'u'llah's ascension, and the perils of a still unsettled situation were revived, it was becoming increasingly evident that the insidious forces of decay, which for many a long year were eating into the vitals of the diseased nation, were now moving to a climax. A series of internal convulsions, each more devastating than the previous one, had already been unchained, destined to bring in their wake one of the most catastrophic occurrences of modern times. So the Guardian here is alluding to the period in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where the Ottoman Empire was called by, I think it was the Tsar of Russia that gave it the name, the sick man of Europe. Already before the Ottoman Empire even collapsed, the great powers of Europe, particularly Russia and Germany and Austria, were trying to figure out how they could get parts of the Ottoman Empire because they figured it was about to collapse. And so the first thing that happened that the Guardian mentions, it says the murder of that arrogant despot in the year 1876. Well, this was really tough for me to figure out what he was talking about, because I finally figured it was Sultan Abdul Aziz. What happened? He's the one that banished Baha'u'lláh to Akka. But he was deposed. And then a couple of days after he was deposed, they found him dead under what Wikipedia says were mysterious and circumstances. So he was apparently murdered, assassinated, but he had been deposed a couple of days before this happened. So this is the Sultan who treated Baha'u'lláh so badly. And then the Turks kept getting into conflict with Russia. We had earlier in the 19th century the Crimean War, but then later in the 1870s, shortly after the Sultan was murdered and his son took over, Abul Hamid, the Russians kept winning, and so they kept taking more and more territory. And then a number of the regions of the Ottoman Empire rebelled. Bulgaria is the main one that comes to mind. And they put it down with such terrible atrocities, just killing thousands and thousands of the Christian citizens of Bulgaria, that the citizens of Bulgaria have never forgotten it and hate Islam to this day. because of their treatment toward the end of the Ottoman period. And then, of course, the rise of the Young Turk movement, which would precipitate the fall of Abdul Hamid. It was the Young Turk movement, the assassination attempt on the Sultan a few years before he was finally deposed, that saved Abdul Baha when he was about to be sent by the Commission of Inquiry to the sands of Libya to die there. And then, of course, in 1909, this is the year that the Sultan was finally completely overthrown. And the Turkish, they didn't fully become a republic at that point, but they began to have a major political change. And even though this occurred in 1909, there was still a great deal of confusion about whether or not the political prisoners of the Ottoman Empire were all free as of that point. So Abdul Baha continued to consider himself a political prisoner bound to stay within the city of Akka. So finally, the local officials in Akka wrote to Istanbul and they said, does this mean Abdul Baha is free? And they said yes. So that is when in 1910, Abdul Baha finally moved out of Akka and moved into his house in Haifa in the summer of 1910, because finally, because of the Turkish Revolution, he was officially free. And of course, he only stayed in his house a month, and then he headed off to Egypt and then to the west. The Balkan Wars with their calamitous consequences. The liberation of Palestine. So this is the Turkish Empire, particularly with the Treaty of Versailles. Most of the Eastern Ottoman lands, many of the Ottoman territories were turned into mandates or given complete independence under the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, Palestine was made a mandate territory and was given to the British. So they were that region was emancipated and no longer either under Ottoman rule or under any sort of political system that would enforce Islamic law. So with the fall of the Sultan, there was nobody to keep that going anymore. And that, of course, also meant the extinction of the caliphate and the disestablishment of Islam as the state religion of the Ottoman Empire. And this was further reinforced with Ataturk, when Ataturk became the head of Turkey at the end of World War I. He turned Turkey into a secular state. Yes? Hello there. Hi, Hoda. Let's see who else has joined us.
What's up?
So that sounds like Maveen. Are you on there? Nope. Manab. Yes. Hello. We're just talking tonight about the fall of Islam after the treatment of Bahá'u'lláh, the awful treatment of Bahá'u'lláh and the Bab by both Sunni and Shia Islam, and the very swift consequences, divine retribution that happened. So the list here is one that Chogi Effendi compiled. I, of course, turned it into bullet points and was sort of going after it. So Turkey was turned into a secular state at the end of World War I when Mustafa Ataturk took over as head of that country. He is now considered the father of Turkey. You go to Turkey, you find his statues everywhere. They love Ataturk. But the one thing he decided was that Islam as a state religion had to go. And so for many years, particularly the military of Turkey enforced the suppression of Islam and essentially made it so that Sharia law, the Islamic law and so forth could not be enforced. And instead there was a civil code. Now, if you've been following what's going on in Turkey today, you will know that the current head of Turkey, Erdogan, I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, has tried to return Turkey to being an Islamic state, and that's where it seems to be headed. But at the time Shoghi Effendi wrote this, Turkey had the Sunni Islamic influence over Turkey was almost gone. And this, he points out, as a form of divine retribution. So also the suppression of various orders, beliefs, traditions, ceremonials that were integrally part of the Islamic faith. Well, for example, under Ataturk, he changed the alphabet to the Cyrillic and away from the Arabic alphabet for writing Turkish. And he also ordered men to start dressing in Western clothes. They got rid of the headdresses and moved to the fezzes, and tried to eliminate many other traditions and ceremonies that were vestiges of Islam. And it happened quickly. I mean, we're talking less than 20 years that Turkey went, and the Ottoman Empire went through this very dramatic change. And most of it occurred right at the end of World War I. So Shoghi Effendi is pointing out that if you mess with the Baha'i faith, God has got something bad in store for you. These followed with an ease and swiftness that no man had dared envisage. Evidences of the directing hand and the departed founder of his faith, Bahá'u'lláh, who from the invisible realm was unloosing a flood of well-deserved calamities upon a rebellious religion and nation. God is just. So then he says to start comparing Jerusalem and Constantinople. Jerusalem was the center of those who persecuted Jesus and the early Christians. And he reminds us that what happened to Jerusalem after Jesus's execution, within about 20 or 30 years, because of a rebellion in Palestine, the Romans sent an army and they laid siege to Jerusalem and just about leveled most of the city, including destroying the temple, desecrating it, and transporting off to Rome many of its treasures. And then they put the 10th Legion, that's the pagan colony they're talking about. They stationed the 10th Legion on the hilltops that constitute Jerusalem and massacred the Jews and expelled many of the survivors. So that's what happened to the people who persecuted Jesus. And Jesus talked about this. He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou hast killed the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as the hen gathereth her chickens under her wings." So before his passing, shortly before his passing, Jesus himself talked about Jerusalem and its waywardness and its future plight. So the Guardian says, compare that to what Baha'u'lláh says about Constantinople. The throne of tyranny hath been verily established upon thee. And he talks about during his own lifetime, what he saw there. He said, the foolish were ruling over the wise, and darkness vaunting itself against the light. Thou art indeed filled with manifest pride. Hath thine outward splendor made thee vainglorious? By him who is the Lord of mankind, it shall soon perish. And thy daughters and thy widows and all the kindreds that dwell within thee shall lament. And so let's see. He then wrote to the Sultan who was persecuting him and warned him. Sarvi, can you read this paragraph here about the Sultan?
Sure. To Sultan Abdul Aziz, the monarch who decreed each of Baha'u'llah's 3 banishments, the founder of our faith, while a prisoner in the Sultan's capital, addressed these words: Hearken, O king, to the speech of him that speaketh the truth, him that doth not ask thee to recompense him with the things God hath chosen to bestow upon thee, him who unerringly treadeth the straight path. Set before thine eyes God's unerring balance, and, as one standing in his presence, weigh in that balance thine actions every day, every moment of thy life. Bring thyself to account ere thou art summoned to a reckoning, on the day when no man shall have strength to stand for fear of God, the day when the hearts of the heedless ones shall be made to tremble.
Gave him a chance. This is was the Sultan's opportunity to put himself down the right path. Then Baha'u'llah addresses the ministers of the Turkish state of the Ottoman Empire, and tells them how they should behave, and reminds them that the days of your life shall roll away, and all the things with which ye are occupied, which ye boast yourselves, shall perish. You will be most certainly summoned by a company of his angels to appear at the spot where the limbs of the entire creation shall be made to tremble. This is the day that shall inevitably come upon you, the hour that none can put back. So he says, you guys may think you're riding high right now, but guess what? God has something in store for you. But so he's first of all admonished and warned the Sultan, then the ministers of the Ottoman Empire, the government officials, but he hasn't finished. He also warns the inhabitants of Constantinople, telling them to fear God, and sow not the seeds of dissension among men. Your days will pass away, and that God will raise up a new people who will call to remembrance of our days and tell of our trials, if you don't hearken to my word. Hearken ye unto my speech, and turn ye to God and repent. The greatness of his mercy surpasseth the fury of his wrath, and his grace encompasseth all who have been called into being and been clothed with the robe of life, be they of the past or of the future. Finally, he gives these prophetic words. Thou hast, O chief, committed that which made Muhammad, the apostle of God, groan in the most exalted paradise. The day is approaching when the land of mystery, Adrianople, and what is beside it shall be changed and shall pass out of the hands of the king, and commotion shall appear, and the voice of lamentation shall be raised, and the evidences of mischief shall be revealed on all sides, and confusion shall spread by reason of that which hath befallen these captives at the hands of the host of oppression. So he's laying the responsibility on not just the Sultan, but also his ministers and the people of Constantinople who've put up with all this, and telling them that things are going to change because of what they've done. Sarush, can you read this next paragraph, 13?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about the background noise.
That's all right.
1300 years had to elapse from the death of the Prophet Muhammad ere the illegitimacy of the institution of the Caliphate, the founders of which had usurped the authority of the lawful successors of the Apostle of God, would be fully and publicly demonstrated. An institution which in its inception had trampled upon so sacred a right, had unchained the forces of so distressful a schism, an institution which in the latter days had dealt so grievous a blow to a faith whose forerunner was himself a descendant of the very imams whose authority that institution had repudiated, deserved full well the chastisement that had sealed its fate. Should I continue?
Can you unpack that for us? Can you I'm sure you probably know the story of how the Caliphate and the Sunni branch got started. So what is Shoghi Effendi talking about here?
I'm still trying to follow myself. I wasn't fully on board here. I'm
Oh, okay.
trying to.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No.
Anyone else? If you don't want to answer, we can get someone else.
Didn't the caliphate start with Abu Bakr?
Yes.
I think you had already discussed that. What was it, 2 weeks ago, or was it? Or was I in another meeting? But it's in World
No,
War.
we did brush upon it once before, but I just didn't realize that's what this was referring to. I was trying to calculate like 300 years. When is that?
Oh,
Yeah, but if it's talking about the Sunnis, yeah, it started with Abu Bakr, and that he's the father-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. And after his death, it was, well, the people who would eventually form the Sunni schism decided that they would hold some kind of election, according to my understanding. And the father-in-law, of course, was actually older than Muhammad, and I think altogether, I don't want to say, actually, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure about the time, how many years it was, but yeah, so after him, it was Omar, and then Osman, and then Ali, finally the son of Muhammad. And then after these four Sunni caliphs had passed away, that's when the final schism happened. And officially, I think that's when the separation between the Shiites and the Sunnis was begun.
Thank you. Shaheen, did you want to add some to that or explain more of this paragraph here?
just that sufficient. That famous line: "The book is sufficient unto us," which led to the martyrdom of the imams and the martyrdom of the Bab.
Right. Right. So he's saying that it took 1,300 years for this group that thwarted Muhammad's appointment of Ali and the imams to finally have their comeuppance, and that these were the same people who not only went after the imams, but they went after the descendant of the imams, which would be the Bab. So God is just. John, could you read the next paragraph, please? If you're there.
Of course, yes. The text of certain Mohammedan traditions, the authenticity of which Muslims themselves recognize, and which have been extensively quoted by eminent Oriental Baha'i scholars and authors, will serve to corroborate the argument and illuminate the theme I have attempted to expound. In the latter days, a grievous calamity shall befall my people at the hands of their ruler, a calamity such as no man ever heard to surpass it. So fierce will it be that none can find a shelter. God will then send down one of my descendants, one sprung from my family, who will fill the earth with equity and justice, even as it hath been filled with injustice and tyranny. And again, a day shall be witnessed by my people, whereon there will have remained of Islam not but a name, and of the Quran not but a mere appearance. The doctors of that age shall be the most evil the world hath ever seen. Mischief hath proceeded from them, and on them will it recoil. And again, at that hour his malediction shall descend upon you, and your curse will it recoil. No, and your curse shall afflict you. and your religion shall remain an empty word on your tongues. And when these signs appear amongst you, anticipate the day when the red-hot wind will have swept over you, or the day when ye will have been disfigured, or when stones will have rained upon you. Well, that was pretty deep.
Any of that seem like some of these things are happening today?
Yeah, totally. Like, that's Muslim equals terrorist.
Well, and even before that happened, the latter days, a grievous calamity shall befall my people at the hands of their ruler. I mean, look at the reason that the Bab came to Iran was because it was the most corrupt and backward country in the civilized world. You know, Chogi Finney is very clear about that. And you know, the people of this has been one of the great quandaries for Islam is they look around the rest of the world and they see themselves as a backward people, and they don't understand how that can be possible if they have the one true religion. So the Islamic world had fallen, and by the 19th century had become extremely backward, just even in terms of technology. You know, until the Templars came to Palestine, the German Templars, there weren't any bridges in Palestine anymore. They weren't using the wheel. They were only using pack animals and horses. They've forgotten that technology. So there's been many grievous calamities that have hit that part of the world. And now it's essentially talking about the spiritual death of Islam. Your religion shall remain an empty word on your tongue. O people of the Quran, Baha'u'lláh, addressing the combined forces of Sunni and Shia Islam, significantly affirms, verily the Prophet of God, Muhammad, sheddeth tears at the sight of your cruelty. Ye have assuredly followed your evil and corrupt desires and turned away your face from the light of guidance. Ere long will ye witness the result of your deeds. For the Lord, my God, lieth in wait and is watchful of your behavior, O concourse of Muslim divines. By your deeds, the exalted station of the people hath been abased. The standard of Islam hath been reversed, and its mighty throne hath fallen. So we can look at Iran under the Ayatollah and see some evidences of that. So he says that this isn't alone. Islam, these retributive calamities are the most among the most stirring occurrences of this age of transition, and some of the most startling and significant events of contemporary history. But he says this disruptive process, which will lead to the complete reorganization and unification of the world in every aspect of its life, has not left Christianity alone either. He says, what's happened to them? That it didn't just attack the religion of Muhammad, it has attacked the faith of Christ. He says that it's too early to know what the role of Christian institutions will be in this formative age of the faith. We're not big enough yet to threaten Christianity in the same way we threatened Islam. So let's see. Imam, can you read? Excuse me. Let me ask Sarvi. I haven't picked on Sarvi yet. Can you read the next two paragraphs, please?
Sure. Where it begins.
That the forces of your religion.
Sure. That the forces of irreligion, of a purely materialistic philosophy, of unconcealed paganism have been unloosed, are now spreading, and by consolidating themselves, are beginning to invade some of the most powerful Christian institutions of the Western world, no unbiased observer can fail to admit. That these institutions are becoming increasingly restive, that a few among them are already dimly aware of the pervasive influence of the cause of Baha'u'lláh, that they will, as their inherent strength deteriorates and their discipline relaxes, regard with deepening dismay the rise of his new world order, and will gradually determine to assail it. That such an opposition will in turn accelerate their decline, few, if any, among those who are attentively watching the progress of his faith would be inclined to question. The vitality of men's belief in God, Baha'u'lláh has testified, is dying out in every land. Nothing short of his wholesome medicine can ever restore it. The corrosion of ungodliness is eating into the vitals of human society. What else but the elixir of his potent revelation can cleanse and revive it? The world is in travail, he has further written, and its agitation waxeth day by day. Its face is turned towards waywardness and unbelief. Such shall be its plight, that to disclose it now would not be meet and seemly.
Thank you. When I was working for the International Teaching Center, particularly the last couple of years I was there, where we had countries in the world that were really blossoming, the Baha'i communities were blossoming with the Institute process, and especially the children's classes and junior youth. One of the things that I always was happy to see were reports of persecution of the Baha'i community by a religious group. Usually they were local priests. And they particularly didn't like our children's classes and junior youth classes. When they start noticing us, when we start doing things, then we get persecuted. So the more successful we are, the more of the churches are going to go after us. I mean, this has happened in the past in the United States. For example, in the 1940s, Dorothy Baker and her husband were so successful at teaching the faith in Lima, Ohio, that the churches in Lima organized a boycott of Frank Baker's bakery. He had the main bakery in town, and the churches tried to boycott it because they were so successful with the faith. The Baptists and some others have put out tracts against us, but generally we're too small and we're not very effective at what we do, and so they leave us alone. And that's why the Guardian is saying we don't quite know what they're going to do, but ultimately they will. But look at the signs of how Christianity is collapsing around us. The forces of irreligion, purely materialistic philosophy, unconcealed paganism. So friends, what do you think Christmas trees are a sign of? Unconcealed paganism. Has nothing to do with Jesus. It's usurping the holy day to celebrate his coming into the world. Santa Claus. All of that is a form of unconcealed paganism. Christians actually forbid those kinds of celebrations 250 years ago. Look at all of the groups that want to hold ceremonies at Stonehenge and other places on the solstices. This is paganism returning. All the New Age stores selling crystals. That's paganism. It's out there. We're watching it return. And then let's talk about this wonderful paragraph. The vitality of men's belief in God is dying out in every land. Its face is turned towards waywardness and unbelief. So not just unbelief, but people are just acting out any way they want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Someone could say that this is just rituals, and every religion has it. Now, Baha'i faith, I don't think does, but every religion has some sort of ritual as time goes on. So someone could say that maybe 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now in the Baha'i faith, someone might say every at Yamaha we're going to put a tree up. You know, would that not fall under paganism as well?
No, because the decorating of trees in midwinter was a pagan ritual in pre-Christian Northern Europe. So it's returning to an earlier tradition that was based on pagan rituals. The mistletoe that people put up at Christmas is based on a Druid pagan ritual. So it has nothing to do with Christianity. It's the resurgence of the earlier religions coming back. That's what really paganism is. Now, all of those religions in their beginning had a divine founder. We just don't know who they were. But over time, they developed into worshiping trees and rocks and things like mistletoe, which is a parasite that grows on trees. The Christmas tree comes from Northern European pagan midwinter practices. And Prince Albert brought it to England from his native Germany. And from there, it just spread as a custom. So there are many hardcore Christian churches in the United States that don't allow Santa Claus and Christmas trees and so forth. There are not many of them, I should say, but there are churches that don't allow them. So, but what about this dying out in every land, the vitality of men's belief in God? What is your experience with your friends, with the people you encounter around you outside of the Baha'i faith?
Well, I notice speaking as a person who wasn't born Baha'i, that a lot of people that I know will talk about, oh, I left Christianity or Islam and became a secular person, like an atheist or somebody, or they might decide to become spiritual but not religious. And so when I talk about the Baha'i faith with them, they're often surprised that I went the other way. I went from being very not religious as a child, often atheist at times, to becoming a Baha'i. So I would say that a lot of this, and I think I like a lot, so my experience is that as a whole, people that I know are moving away from belief in God.
What did the rest of you see among your friends and relatives?
For me, at least, those that are religious and have a religious upbringing, they stay that way. And actually more so, they're more extreme towards Christianity. But those that never had a right background or were trying to rebel against it, there's so many parts of religion that they just, because of I think what it is, because politics has sort of taken over them, they have sort of pushed religion away because their love for some sort of policy or politics is just too overwhelming for them.
Okay. So he's then talking about how this menace of secularism, which has been coming on for several hundred years, by the way, has already attacked Islam. I mean, Ataturk is a good example about that. It's invaded Persia, penetrated India. We're particularly seeing it in Europe and increasingly in the United States, challenging the basis of every established religion, and now including Christian. The wave of materialism is sweeping around the world, which comes in part from the modern industrialization, but it's materialism is penetrating everywhere. Everybody wants to own stuff, right? Okay, so let's see.
Kathy, I have a question
Go ahead.
real quick.
Mhm.
Do you think that Christianity has gotten worse in the past 200 years, or do you think that because people are, especially in the US, are so big on equality of women and men all of a sudden, and Black Lives Matter and all these things, that the church has sort of taken that and said, you know what, forget what our past says, we're just going to make it revolutionized because this is what people want. Do you think that's helping their faith or turning more people away?
The evangelical churches, which are the only ones that seem to have any large following these days, are more focused on personal salvation. The mainline churches, by which I mean, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the main Baptists, not the Southern Baptists, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and so forth, have all become social justice warriors, where they spend all their time talking about social justice issues, and they no longer talk about individual salvation, prayer, life after death. And so they have congregations that are very happy to save the whales and take up a collection for the current cause, but they have no spiritual underpinning, other than this seems the moral thing to do based on Christ's teachings. And they don't know how to help a dying person, a family facing a calamity, because the whole spiritual underpinning is not there. So this is why people are turning to the evangelical churches, because they still talk about being saved, having your personal relationship with Jesus. So they're all confused. They're all confused, because having your personal relationship with Jesus can be a very selfish thing. You have to be both outwardly and inwardly looking. And most of the churches, particularly the Protestant ones, are inward looking. The the outward looking, the inward evangelical are more inward looking. And then you have the Catholic Church, which is just lost. They don't know what they believe anymore. And they're demoralized. They're demoralized, particularly in all the places where there have been the sex scandals, the child abuse scandals. So they're just lost.
So
Yeah. Why not?
with regards to evangelicals, I've dialogued with a lot of them, especially since I went to an evangelical church and had a grounding in that tradition before I became a Baha'i. And in fact, their belief that, oh, if you don't believe in Jesus, then you won't be saved and you will be condemned to hell, was one of the chief reasons I became a Baha'i, because the Baha'i faith seemed a lot more inclusive and accepting of pretty much any belief system than Christianity was.
Right.
But I guess there's one thing that the Christians have. I've been going to some evangelical or other conservative church services during this whole pandemic. I found that they really are. I found that, especially in their worship services, that personal relationship with Jesus and sense of being reborn is very powerful. I was wondering if the Baha'i faith could offer something equivalent to that.
I remember when I was first a Baha'i, our auxiliary board member at that time, who was African American, laughing about people looking for fire insurance. In other words, they wanted to be sure they weren't going to hell. They were trying to get the assurance that they were saved, that they were okay in God's eyes, and that when they died, they would be going to a good place and not to hell. And the Baha'i faith doesn't offer that assurance, because we tell people that what you do in this life, it matters all the way up to the end of your life. And that if you say you believe, so and many of the evangelical churches say that you are saved by belief alone. So if you correctly have the right theology, the right belief system, then what you do is less important. And this is sort of comes out of some of the teachings of Martin Luther as part of the early Reformation. But the Baha'i say it's not just a matter of right belief, it's also a matter of deeds. Because in essence, I mean, Jesus said this, if you love me, heed my commandments. If you say you believe, but you don't act on the teachings of the messenger of God you say that you believe in, you don't really believe in it, or else you'd be acting differently. So anyway, but this assurance of you were saved forever because you had a convergent experience and you went and were baptized is very comforting to many people. But it's the Baha'i faith says it's more complicated than that. And so you can still get in the Baha'i faith, we are not just looking for faith, we're looking for certitude. So we look at proofs, we look at rational proofs as well as heart proofs in the Baha'i faith. And that should make us not just have faith that Baha'u'lláh is who he says he is, but absolute certainty, certitude that he is who he says he is. That's a very big discussion. But because I'm looking at the clock, I'd like to ask you, Manav, if you could read from The Church Has a New Danger.
Yes.
Please.
The church has a new danger to face in land after land. Determined and hostile attack. From Soviet Russia, a definitely anti-religious communism is pushing west into Europe and America. East into Persia, India, China, and Japan. It is an economic theory that definitely harnessed to disbelief in God. It is a religious irreligion. It has a passionate sense of mission and is carrying on its anti-God campaign at the church's base at home, as well as launching its offensive against its front line in non-Christian lands. Such a conscious, avowed, organized attack against religion in general, and Christianity in particular, is something new in history. Equally deliberate in some lands is it in its determined hostility to Christianity is another form of social and political faith, nationalism. But the nationalist attack on Christianity, unlike communism, is often bound up with some form of national religion, with Islam in Persia and Egypt, with Buddhism in Ceylon, while the struggle for communal rights in India is allied with the revival both of Hinduism and Islam.
Right, okay. Actually, can you keep going through this next paragraph, please?
I need not attempt in this connection an exposition of the origin and character of those economic theories and political philosophies of the post-war world period that have directly and indirectly exerted and are still exerting their pernicious influence on the institutions and beliefs connected with one of the most widely spread and best organized religious systems of the world. It is with their influence rather than with their origin that I'm chiefly concerned. The excessive growth of industrialism and its attendant evils, as the aforementioned quotation bears witness, the aggressive policies initiated and the persistent efforts exerted by the inspirers and organizers of the communist movement, the intensification of a militant nationalism associated in certain countries with its systematized work of defamation against all forms of ecclesiastical influence, have no doubt contributed to the de-Christianization of the masses and been responsible for a notable decline in the authority, the prestige, and the power of the church. The whole conception of God, the persecutors of the Christian religion have insistently proclaimed, a conception derived from the ancient Oriental despotisms. It is a conception quite unworthy of free men. Religion, one of their leaders has asserted, is an opiate of the people. Religion, declares the text of the official publications, is a brutalization of the people. Education must be so directed as to efface from the people's minds this humiliation and this idiocy.
Thank you. I hate to say this because it will sound political, but there are people who are part of the incoming administration who really believe that education must have all signs of religion eradicated from it. We know that we don't want children indoctrinated into a religion you don't want them to be indoctrinated in, but even the concept of God and morals based on conscience is too much for some people. The idea of the Ten Commandments is too much for many people in the secular world. So this is the 30s. This is the period where Stalin is in power in Russia. And communism was a very attractive alternative to capitalism in the first half of the 20th century in many Western countries, because idealists looked at the terrible things that happened with unbridled capitalism and how the workers and industries were treated, and felt that communism as an economic system was a good thing. But wedded to communism was the idea of the deification of the state, and in order to control everything. And so you couldn't have a competing system, which would be a religious system. And so the communists insisted on atheism and eliminating all vestiges of religion. And so this was one of the missions of the communist government in the Soviet Union, and wherever they had control of the country, to eliminate any vestiges of religion. And we see this now in communist China, and not so much today as there was in the past under Mao, but this deliberate attack on religious entities, because they can organized religion can be the most formidable enemy to a political system. Most of you are too young to know about what happened in Poland and the whole solidarity movement in Poland that helped to undermine and then finally topple the communist government of Poland. And all of the organizing of it occurred in Catholic churches. And it was it was not a surprise that a Pole from was made the Pope during that period, as a way of the Catholic Church trying to stand up to communism and the threat that it posed. So then at the end of this, this quote that the Guardian is using, he didn't write this quote, but it's from someone who's not a Baha'i. Talking about how nationalism, many religious groups around the world are also bound up with a national identity. So you have the Armenian Christian Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox. They will say, well, how many Greek? He's saying that in many parts of the world, as nationalism has grown, the national church has been exerting itself more. The resurgence of Hinduism is more of a nationalistic thing than a religious movement. So he says all of these economic theories, political philosophies are messing everything up, and are because religion looks to many people to be the problem and not the solution. And he gets into the Hegelian philosophy. Anybody know that wanted to try to define Hegel or the Hegelian philosophy? I think Hegel, unfortunately, people took what he had to say and messed it up. But anyone know anything much about that? Well, this early 19th century philosopher, Hegel, late 18th, early 19th century philosopher, many of his ideas became the underpinning of the Nazi Party later. Hegel, I think, would have been absolutely Nazi, but some of his teachings, which I think he was the one who asked, is God dead? The deification of the state and so forth. This next paragraph is really talking about what happened with the rise of fascists, and how we have both fascism and communism, and both of them are just deadly. And that this whole modernist approach, secular approach, industrial approach has helped them to create systems, very sick systems based on materialism. Both these forces, each operating in its own sphere and using its own weapons and methods, have moreover been greatly assisted and encouraged by the prevailing spirit of modernism, with its emphasis on a purely materialistic philosophy, which, as it diffuses itself, tends increasingly to divorce religion from man's daily life. And so if you look at what happened in the countries in Europe under fascism, and essentially what was going on in Iraq under Saddam Hussein and what's going on in Syria is the last vestiges of fascism. Those were Middle Eastern, the Ba'ath Party was set up by the Nazis. It's the Middle Eastern division of the Nazis. So we still have fascist governments, or one fascist government left in the world, and that's the government of Syria, with this deification of the state and increasingly divorcing religion from man's daily life. So he then lists all these things that are inevitable. Let's see if we can finish this tonight. This is going to be a run to get through this. He says all these forces, communism, fascism, all of this is going to clash. And he mentions some of the things that have already happened. Some I've already mentioned. Is that in Russia, the Orthodox Church was essentially disestablished. Church at Rome has the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire emperor was the Holy Roman Empire monarch, and supposedly the one who would be upholding the Church of Rome. And at the end of World War I, that monarchy was eliminated. And then we have the rise of Franco and the Spanish Civil War, which basically completely changed the relationship of the people of Spain to the Catholic Church. I don't know the full persecution of the church in Mexico, but Mexico was under a one-party political system, very corrupt one, for about 100 years. And I think it's still not too far out of that yet. What has happened to Catholics and Lutherans in the heart of Europe, he's talking about the rise of the fascists, the Nazis in the 1930s. The turmoil of another branch of the church, he's talking here, and this happening in Ethiopia. This is Mussolini going into Ethiopia that he's talking about. And of course, there's a very strong branch of Christianity, the Ethiopian church and Christianity, that goes back to the early days of Christianity. And then we have the decline of Christian missions all over the Middle East. It was the Presbyterians who were mainly, and Anglicans who were mainly in those areas. And the Holy See, the ominous signs that foreshadow serious complications in the equivocal and precarious relationship now existing between the Holy See and certain nations on the continent of Europe. The Holy See, of course, is the Vatican, the headquarters of the Catholic Church. And by the 1930s, particularly with the rise of all of the dictators all over the continent of Europe. That was threatening their connection with the main stronghold of Catholicism at that time. So these are some of the things that he's talking about. Then he goes on to say that the many Christian institutions have been shattered. I mean, you look at the amount of Protestant sects all over everywhere. Christianity has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. And then in many parts of the world, you had a conflict between fundamentalist Christians and liberal Christians. Their creeds and dogmas have been watered down and sometimes completely ignored and discarded. Dear friends, the Catholic Church, for all of its many ideas that we would not go along with, has at least tried to uphold some of the teachings of Christ that are hard to get along with, like that if you divorce, you can't remarry if your former spouse is still living. Well, most of the churches long ago jettisoned that. The teachings of the Bible regarding homosexuality, again, totally thrown out. Anything else they don't like, they just throw it out. They say, oh, well, that was then, this is now. All they want to talk about now is what? The churches no longer are the moral leaders of the people of the world. They can't even recruit clergy. This is a huge problem. The number of priests and nuns, particularly in the Catholic Church, is dwindling. Most of them are elderly. The ministers are not willing to speak up, and they just talk out of both sides of their mouth, is what he's saying here. The churches have lost much of their wealth. That's been going on for centuries, but countries have confiscated church properties, and in other ways they have lost their properties. Most of the churches no longer offer schools, religious training. Their temples have many times been deserted and destroyed. You know, when the United States became a nation, before the Revolution, the Church of England was the official church of the English colony. And so there was the disestablishment movement. You know, the old joke about what's the longest word in the English language, and it's disestablishmentarianism. That means being opposed to the people who were trying to eliminate the Church of England as the state religion of the United States. But anyway, besides that little bit of trivia, for 100 years, there were empty Episcopal churches all over the United States from the colonial period, because as soon as it was no longer required that be the state church, many people said, heck, I don't want to go there anymore. So there were colonial churches all over the Eastern Seaboard that were just sitting empty in fields because nobody wanted to go there anymore. Now we have lots of empty churches. In fact, it's become a huge problem, particularly in Europe. All right. If Christianity wishes and expects to serve the world in the present crisis, writes a minister of the Presbyterian Church in America, it must cut back through Christianity to Christ, back through the centuries-old religion about Jesus to the original religion of Jesus. Otherwise, he significantly adds, the Spirit of Christ will live in institutions other than our own. I remember when I was in college at a Methodist college, they were talking about the drive, and there was a whole movement in Christianity back in the 60s and 70s to come up with the historic Jesus, the true Jesus, to get back to what are the original scriptures, to do analysis of the text, to see what the original teachings of Jesus, because we had so lost them over time. Hoda, can you read the next paragraph? So mark the decline.
Sure. so marked a decline in the strength and cohesion of the elements constituting Christian society has led, in its turn, as we might well anticipate, to the emergence of an increasing number of obscure cults, of strange and new worships, of ineffective philosophies, whose sophisticated doctrines have intensified and confusion of a troubled age. In their tenets and pursuits, they may be said to reflect and bear witness to the revolt, the discontent, and the confused aspirations of the disillusioned masses that have deserted the cause of the Christian churches and seceded from their membership.
How many of you see these evidence of this? Obscure cults, strange new worships, ineffective philosophies. They're everywhere, right? In California, you are ground zero for that, I think, especially in the Bay Area.
Oh, yeah.
And then our dear Shoghi Effendi, who loved reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, it says, this is the same sort of thing that was happening in the world of the early Christian era. All these weird sects were coming up. He lists a bunch of them. There was the Christian faith that was able to dominate and undermine and get rid of those weird sects by spreading its influence. And so we will be doing the same thing. So let's see. Imam, can you read the next paragraph, please? Such institutions.
Such institutions as have strayed far from the spirit and the teachings of Jesus Christ must of necessity, as an embryonic world order of Baha'u'lláh, take shape and unfold, recede into the background and make way for the progress of the divinely ordained institutions that stand inextricably interwoven with his teachings. The indwelling Spirit of God, which in the apostolic age of the Church animated its members, the pristine purity of its teachings, the primitive brilliancy of its light, will no doubt be reborn and revived as an inevitable consequence of this redefinition of its fundamental verities and the clarification of its original purpose.
So what does that mean to you?
I guess, is it saying like the institutions, like the local, national, those institutions in the Baha'i faith are there to prevent anything like that happening, similar to what happened in Christianity?
And the spirit of the early Christian church, when it was still pure, still reflecting Jesus, will live through the Baha'i faith.
The Christian church will, what was that, Kath?
The indwelling spirit of God, which was, he says, he says, first of all, these old institutions of the Christian faith, which strayed away from his teachings, are going to go into the background in order for the Baha'i institutions, the progress of the divinely ordained institutions that stand inextricably woven with his teachings. This is the world order of Bahá'u'lláh, will take over, will supplant the institutions of Christianity that have strayed far from them. But that the spirit that was found in the Christian church in its early days will no doubt be reborn and revived as the inevitable consequence of this redefinition of its fundamental verities and the clarification of its original purpose. So Jesus will really be fulfilled through the world order of Baha'u'lláh. It will recapture what's been lost. So he wants us to remember that as he's talking about what's happened to Christianity, he's in no way putting down the founder of Christianity, and ends this section with this wonderful tribute that you're probably all familiar with, which I'll ask Sarvi to read, this glowing tribute which Baha'u'lláh himself has been moved to pay to the author of the Christian religion. So can you start reading that quote, "Know thou"?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Know thou that when the Son of Man yielded up his breath to God, the whole creation wept with a great weeping. By sacrificing himself, however, a fresh capacity was infused into all created things. Its evidences, as witnessed in all the peoples of the earth, are now manifest before thee. The deepest wisdom which the sages have uttered, the profoundest learning which any mind hath unfolded, the arts which the ablest hands have produced, the influence exerted by the most potent of rulers, are but manifestations of the quickening power released by his transcendent, his all-pervasive and resplendent spirit. We testify that when he came into the world, he shed the splendor of his glory upon all created things. Through him, the leper recovered from the leprosy of perversity and ignorance. Through him, the unchaste and wayward were healed. Through his power, born of Almighty God, the eyes of the blind were opened, and the soul of the sinner sanctified. He it is who purified the world. Blessed is the man who, with a face beaming with light, hath turned towards him.
What an amazing tribute to Christ. So any last comments, thoughts, questions about what we've gone over this evening?
I like this last paragraph in the sense of how Baha'u'lláh, well, as it says, gives a glowing tribute to Jesus, in the sense that he both states the truth of Jesus with using the words, using biblical words, but without so much as a hint of any kind of particular interpretation that could be misconstrued. And in fact, what he does is he simultaneously praises and also elevates the station of Christ from one of a literal understanding to one of one of a divine standard.
Mm-hmm.
For example, that he says, through him the unchaste and wayward were healed. Right? Through him the leper recovered from the leprosy of perversity and ignorance. So he does it, it's like he does the two at once.
Right. He's giving us the view of Jesus with spiritual eyes, but yet giving enough markers from the story of Jesus that a Christian could hold on and say, yes, this is the Christ that I know that he's talking about. This is such a beautiful passage, and it, for those of us who were raised as Christians, is exceptionally meaningful, but I've many times enjoyed sharing it with Christian friends when they want to know what we think about Jesus.
What do they say in comment when you do you remember?
You know, they usually don't know what to comment, because one of the things that I find when I share Baha'i quotes with my Christian friends is that the language is so elevated that they first have to help them unpack it, you know, if they're willing to let you do that.
Yeah, that's true. They're not using such elevated language.
Yeah, they're very taken by the language. It's very biblical language. They can see that there's something there, but they're not accustomed to unpacking it. By the way, one of the things that when my husband and I were taking a group of non-Baha'is through book 1, and they started having difficulty with the language. These were all people who had graduate degrees. I explained to them that one of them said, well, whoever did the translation should have used more contemporary language and not things like thou and thee and so forth. Well, first of all, you may or may not know that thee and thou are the English equivalent of the difference between vous and du in French, or languages where you have a personal you and a impersonal you. So someone you don't know, you'll use the impersonal, and the person that's close to you use a personal pronoun when you talk to them. English has now dropped thee and thou, but these are the personal. It's much more personal than just saying you, if you were true to the original language of English. And that also because Bahá'u'lláh writes in very elevated Persian or Arabic. These elevated translations are a closer rendition than a more worldly translation. And then when you explain it that way, they go, oh, okay, that makes sense. So it gets closer to the true spirit and quality of the original text. But they do find it difficult. And I've come to appreciate that why the first practice of book one is to share a prayer with somebody. And the process of sharing a Baha'i prayer with someone helps you unpack the language with them so they get accustomed to it. So anyway. Well, dear friends, next week, the next two sections I'm going to try to cover are the ones signs of moral downfall and then political decay, which I'm sure will also resonate with what's going on around us. So the following week, we should be able to finish up the last of this letter, and that will be the end of the world order letters. And we can discuss what folks want to do from there. I need to start concentrating over the next 3 months on finishing the manuscript for my book, but we can see what you folks want to do going forward to study something if you want to continue. So something to think about.
Agreed. Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you, dear Kathy. I'm sorry I missed your your talk on Sunday. I got the email late.
Oh, that's all right. Well, they're going to put it up on the website so you can hear it anytime.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.